The strangest thing about that night wasn't that a billionaire CEO told a single dad he needed a wife. It was what happened after he answered. The ballroom of the Sterling Foundation shimmered beneath crystal chandeliers that cast warm gold light across hundreds of guests dressed in tailored suits and elegant evening gowns. Soft piano music drifted through the air, while waiters moved quietly between tables carrying sparkling water and polished silver trays. It was the annual charity gala, one of the most anticipated events in Colorado each winter, a gathering where politicians, executives, philanthropists, and local business leaders came together to celebrate generosity. Yet among all the wealth in the room, the person who drew the attention of Richard Sterling was a man standing near the back wall beside a little girl. Ethan Brooks adjusted the sleeve of his navy blazer and glanced down at his daughter. Lily, 8 years old, sat quietly in her wheelchair, her bright blue dress carefully smoothed across her lap. She looked up at him and smiled. Ethan smiled back. It was the kind of smile that carried years of sacrifice, sleepless nights, and promises kept. He had no interest in being noticed tonight. He was only there because the foundation had honored several local volunteers, and someone had nominated him for rebuilding playground equipment in low-income neighborhoods. To Ethan, it had never been charity. It was simply the right thing to do. Across the ballroom, Victoria Sterling stood near the stage speaking with donors. At 34, she had become the CEO of Sterling Logistics and one of the most recognizable business leaders in the region. Intelligent, confident, and composed under pressure, she carried herself with the effortless authority of someone accustomed to being the most powerful person in the room. But tonight, her father seemed unusually distracted. Richard kept glancing toward Ethan. Finally, Victoria followed his gaze. "Dad," she said with amusement, "you've been staring at that man for 20 minutes. Richard smiled into his glass. That man is the kind of man most people spend their entire lives searching for. Victoria raised an eyebrow. The volunteer? The father, Richard corrected. The man who stayed after everyone else left to help clean up. The man who spent his own money fixing equipment for children he doesn't even know. The man who never once asked for recognition. Victoria laughed softly. You sound impressed. Richard nodded. I am. Then he looked directly at his daughter. In fact, if you ask me, that's exactly the kind of husband you need. Victoria nearly choked on her drink. Excuse me. Richard simply smiled and walked away. The comment should have been forgotten. Instead, an hour later, standing on stage during a lighthearted fundraising segment, Victoria spotted Ethan near the front of the crowd. Lily sat beside him, listening attentively as guests laughed and applauded. An impulsive idea crossed Victoria's mind. With a playful grin, she stepped down from the stage microphone and approached Ethan. The room gradually quieted, curious about what the CEO was doing. Victoria stopped in front of him. Mr. Brooks, she said. Ethan looked up politely. Yes. A mischievous smile appeared on her face. My father says you need a wife. Laughter rippled through the ballroom. Several guests turned to watch. Victoria expected embarrassment. She expected awkwardness. What she did not expect was the calm look that appeared in Ethan's eyes as he slowly turned toward his daughter before answering. The laughter lingered for another second before fading into an uncomfortable hush. Ethan did not react the way everyone expected. He did not blush. He did not force a smile. He did not look embarrassed. Instead, he turned slowly toward Lily. The little girl looked back at him with complete trust, her small hands folded neatly in her lap. For a moment, the ballroom seemed to disappear. The music softened into the background. The conversation stopped. Even the waiters paused near the edges of the room. Ethan knelt beside his daughter and gently adjusted a loose strand of hair behind her ear. Then he stood again and looked directly at Victoria. His voice was calm, steady, and impossible to ignore. A wife would not change my life very much, he said. A few people exchanged confused glances. Victoria's smile remained, though it had begun to fade. Ethan continued, but the right mother could change hers. The room went silent, completely silent. Victoria felt her breath catch unexpectedly. The confidence she carried into every boardroom suddenly seemed less certain. Ethan was not angry. He was not defensive. He was simply honest. That honesty landed with more force than any clever comeback ever could. Lily looked up at her father and smiled. Ethan returned the smile before placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. That is what matters to me, he added quietly. No one laughed now. A donor near the front lowered his glass. A city councilman shifted awkwardly in his chair. Across the room, Richard Sterling watched with a faint smile that suggested he had expected exactly this outcome. Victoria opened her mouth, searching for something witty to say, but nothing came. For perhaps the first time in years, words failed her. Ethan offered a polite nod and returned his attention to Lily as though the moment were already over. The guests slowly resumed their conversations, but the energy had changed. Something invisible had shifted. Victoria remained standing there for another second before quietly returning to the stage. She finished the fundraiser presentation without missing any of her talking points, yet her mind was somewhere else entirely. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of handshakes, photographs, and speeches. Still, she found herself glancing toward the back of the ballroom. Ethan never tried to approach her. He never asked for a business card. He never attempted to impress anyone. When the event finally ended near 10 o'clock, guests began filtering toward the exits. Snow drifted gently outside the tall glass windows, covering the sidewalks in fresh white layers. Victoria was saying goodbye to several board members when she noticed movement near the entrance. Ethan was helping Lily into a van equipped with a wheelchair lift. He moved carefully, patiently, making sure she was warm before pulling his own coat tighter against the cold. Most people would have hurried home after a long evening. Ethan stayed behind. Victoria watched from a distance as he returned inside the nearly empty ballroom. A few volunteers were stacking chairs. Others were gathering decorations. Without being asked, Ethan rolled up his sleeves and started helping. No cameras remained. No reporters were present. There was no audience left to impress. Yet there he was, carrying boxes, folding tables, and helping clean the room. Richard appeared beside his daughter and followed her gaze. "You see it now, do you not?" he asked softly. Victoria kept watching. "See what?" Richard smiled. Character. For the first time that night, Victoria did not have an answer. 3 days passed, yet the moment refused to leave Victoria's mind. She sat at the top floor of Sterling Logistics headquarters, 42 stories above downtown Denver, staring through floor-to-ceiling windows at a city she normally controlled with absolute confidence. Contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars crossed her desk every week. Executives competed for her attention. Investors waited for her approval. Yet somehow the only thing she could think about was a single sentence spoken by a man who had expected nothing from her. The morning sunlight reflected against the glass conference table as her executive assistant entered carrying a stack of reports. "Your 10 o'clock is here," she said. Victoria nodded without looking up. "Reschedule it." The assistant blinked. The board chairman flew in from Chicago. "Reschedule him anyway." After the door closed, Victoria leaned back in her chair. It was not Ethan's answer that troubled her. It was the sincerity behind it. Most people wanted something. Money, influence, access, recognition. Ethan had wanted none of those things. His entire world seemed to revolve around a little girl with bright eyes and quiet courage. Later that afternoon, curiosity finally won. Victoria opened her laptop and searched public records. She expected to find something ordinary. Instead, she found a trail of quiet kindness. Ethan Brooks, age 39, mechanical engineer by training, widower, no lawsuits, no debt collections, no scandals, no social media presence beyond a few photographs of community projects. The deeper she looked, the stranger it became. Every few months, there was another article from a local newspaper. Ethan helping repair playground equipment. Ethan organizing a fundraiser for adaptive sports equipment. Ethan volunteering at a children's hospital holiday event. Ethan mentoring high school robotics students. None of the articles were about him. His name appeared almost accidentally, tucked near the bottom of each story. Victoria clicked through photograph after photograph. In every image, he stood slightly behind everyone else, smiling quietly while others accepted attention. She frowned. That evening, she drove herself to a small neighborhood on the edge of town. Snow covered the sidewalks and rooftops. Warm yellow porch lights glowed against the winter darkness. She parked half a block away from an address she had found online. Ethan's house was modest. White siding, small front yard, an aging pickup truck in the driveway. Nothing about it suggested struggle, yet nothing suggested wealth either. It looked like a home built on responsibility rather than comfort. Through the living room window, she saw movement. Ethan sat beside Lily at a dining table covered with schoolbooks. He appeared to be helping with homework. Lily laughed at something he said. Ethan laughed too. The sound did not reach the street, but the warmth somehow did. Victoria remained in her car longer than she intended. She watched as Ethan stood and carried 2 mugs into the room. Hot chocolate, she guessed. Lily accepted hers with both hands. Then father and daughter returned to studying together. No audience, no recognition, no reward, just presence. Victoria suddenly understood why her father had noticed him. Some people filled a room because they demanded attention. Others filled a room because they carried character. As she drove away, snowflakes drifted across her windshield. For the first time in years, Victoria Sterling found herself wondering whether success and significance were actually the same thing. Deep down, she was beginning to suspect they were not. The following week brought another snowstorm to Denver. Gray clouds hung low over the city while commuters hurried through icy sidewalks and crowded intersections. Inside Sterling Logistics headquarters, Victoria sat through 3 executive meetings, approved 2 acquisitions, and reviewed a quarterly earnings report that would have excited most chief executives. Yet her attention kept drifting elsewhere. By Thursday afternoon, she finally gave up pretending otherwise. She picked up her coat, canceled the remainder of her schedule, and drove across town. The address led her to a community recreation center on the edge of an older neighborhood. Children raced across the gymnasium floor, while parents watched from folding chairs near the walls. Victoria entered quietly and stopped. At the far end of the building, Ethan stood on a ladder repairing a damaged scoreboard. He wore jeans, work boots, and a faded gray sweatshirt. No cameras followed him. No reporters interviewed him. No foundation had sponsored the project. He was simply fixing something that needed fixing. A volunteer approached carrying a toolbox. "Thanks again for helping," the man said. "The city told us repairs could take months." Ethan smiled. "Kids should not have to wait months to play basketball." The volunteer laughed. "You always say yes, do you?" Ethan shrugged. "Only when I can." Victoria remained near the entrance listening. A few minutes later, another woman walked over carrying paperwork. "Ethan, the wheelchair ramp you built last spring is still holding up perfectly." Ethan nodded. "Good. You saved us thousands of dollars." "That was never the point." The woman smiled warmly before walking away. Victoria felt something strange settle over her. Most successful people she knew talked constantly about impact. Ethan seemed completely uninterested in discussing his. An hour later, he climbed down from the ladder and gathered his tools. Before leaving, he walked across the gym to a teenage boy sitting alone on the bleachers. The boy appeared frustrated, staring at a robotics project spread across several notebooks. Ethan sat beside him. They spoke quietly for several minutes. Soon the teenager was smiling again, sketching new ideas across a page. When Ethan finally stood to leave, the boy called after him. "Thank you, Mr. Brooks." Ethan simply waved and headed toward the parking lot. Victoria followed at a distance. Snowflakes drifted through the cold evening air. Ethan loaded his equipment into the pickup truck before noticing her standing nearby. For a brief moment, surprise crossed his face. "Ms. Sterling." Victoria suddenly felt less confident than she had during billion-dollar negotiations. "Hello, Ethan." He closed the truck bed. "What brings you here?" She hesitated. The truthful answer sounded ridiculous even to her. "Because I could not stop thinking about you. Because every person I talk to seems to respect you. Because nothing about you makes sense." Instead, she said, "I was curious." Ethan nodded as though curiosity were a perfectly reasonable reason to drive across the city during a snowstorm. "And did you find what you were looking for?" Victoria looked toward the recreation center behind him. Through the windows, she could still see children playing beneath bright lights. Then she looked back at Ethan. For the first time, she answered honestly, "I am not sure anymore." Ethan studied her for a moment. Then a faint smile appeared. Not arrogant, not amused, simply patient. Somehow that smile left her even more curious than before. Over the next 2 weeks, something unusual happened. Victoria Sterling found reasons to cross paths with Ethan Brooks far more often than coincidence could reasonably explain. Sometimes she told herself it was curiosity. Other times, she blamed her father. Deep down, she knew neither explanation was entirely true. On a cold Tuesday afternoon, she invited Ethan to Sterling Logistics headquarters. The corporate tower rose above downtown Denver like a monument to ambition, glass reflecting the pale winter sun. Ethan arrived exactly on time. His pickup truck looked almost out of place among the luxury sedans parked outside the executive entrance. Victoria met him personally in the lobby. Several employees noticed. More than a few stared. Ethan seemed completely unaware. Or perhaps he simply did not care. Victoria led him to the executive dining room on the 38th floor. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city while fresh snow dusted the distant Rocky Mountains. Lunch was served. Conversation flowed easily enough. Ethan spoke about community projects, Lily's school, and the robotics club he volunteered with. Victoria spoke about expansion plans, supply chains, and international contracts. Yet somehow Ethan seemed more interested when discussing children than she did when discussing billion-dollar deals. Halfway through lunch, Victoria finally revealed the real reason for the invitation. "I have been reviewing your background," she said. Ethan smiled faintly. "That sounds dangerous. You were a mechanical engineer before becoming a consultant. A long time ago. You graduated near the top of your class." Ethan shrugged. "Many people do." Victoria slid a folder across the table. "Sterling Logistics is launching a new infrastructure division. I would like you to lead one of the engineering teams." Ethan looked down at the proposal. The salary alone was more than most people in the room earned in a year. Additional bonuses, benefits, stock options, and relocation incentives filled several pages. Any rational person would have accepted immediately. Victoria expected surprise. Perhaps gratitude. Instead, Ethan calmly closed the folder. "That is generous. Then you accept?" "No," Victoria blinked. "No." Ethan pushed the folder back toward her. No, for several seconds she thought he might be joking. He was not. "Do you realize what this opportunity could do for your future?" she asked. "Yes. The compensation package alone could change your life." Ethan nodded. "Probably. Then why?" He looked out the window for a moment. Far below, traffic moved through the city like streams of light. When he finally spoke, his voice remained calm. "Because Lily finally feels at home." Victoria frowned. Ethan continued. "After my wife passed away, everything changed for her. New routines, new fears, new challenges. It took years for her to trust that life could feel stable again." His expression softened. "Her school is 5 minutes from our house. Her teachers know her. Her friends know her. She smiles every morning when she gets on the bus." Victoria listened quietly. "I cannot trade that away for a bigger paycheck." The room fell silent. Ethan stood and buttoned his coat. "Money solves many problems," he said gently. "But not every problem deserves a financial solution." Then he smiled. "Besides, Lily has a violin recital Friday night." Victoria laughed despite herself. "A violin recital? Most important event on my calendar. More important than this offer?" Ethan's eyes warmed. "Not even close." After he left, Victoria remained alone in the dining room. For the first time in her professional life, someone had rejected an opportunity she believed anyone would want. Strangely, instead of feeling offended, she felt humbled. And somewhere deep inside, admiration quietly began turning into something far more difficult to ignore. Lily's violin recital arrived on a snowy Friday evening. The auditorium at Pine Creek Elementary was not impressive by most standards. The stage curtains were slightly worn, the folding chairs did not match, and the sound system occasionally crackled when someone adjusted a microphone. Yet to Ethan Brooks, it felt more important than any corporate boardroom in Colorado. He arrived nearly an hour early. Lily sat backstage with her violin resting carefully across her knees while dozens of nervous students whispered around her. Ethan knelt beside her. "You ready?" Lily smiled nervously. "Maybe. That is enough. What if I mess up?" Ethan gently squeezed her hand. "Then you keep going." Lily nodded. "Okay." As the audience filled the auditorium, parents searched for seats and teachers hurried between rows. Snow tapped softly against the windows while warm yellow lights illuminated the stage. Then a familiar figure appeared near the entrance. Victoria Sterling stepped quietly inside. Ethan noticed her almost immediately. Surprise crossed his face. "What are you doing here?" he asked when she approached. Victoria smiled. "You said this was the most important event on your calendar." Ethan laughed softly. "You actually remembered that?" "Apparently I did." Neither of them mentioned that Victoria had canceled a dinner with investors to attend. The recital began a few minutes later. One by one, students walked onto the stage. Some played confidently. Others struggled through nervous mistakes. The audience applauded every performance anyway. Then Lily's name was announced. The room seemed to grow still. Ethan sat forward in his seat. Victoria noticed the change immediately. The calm, composed man she had come to know suddenly looked anxious. Not for himself, for his daughter. Lily rolled onto the stage, violin in hand. The spotlight settled gently across her shoulders. For a brief moment, she looked very small beneath the bright lights. Then she lifted the instrument beneath her chin. The first notes drifted through the auditorium. Soft, careful, beautiful. The melody was simple, but there was something honest about it. Every note carried determination. Every phrase carried courage. Ethan never looked away. Victoria glanced toward him and saw something she had never witnessed before. His eyes had filled with tears. He quickly brushed them away, but not before she noticed. There was no embarrassment in them, no weakness, only love. Years of sacrifice, years of showing up, years of choosing someone else's happiness before his own. The realization struck her harder than she expected. She had spent her life surrounded by powerful people, yet very few had ever loved someone with such quiet devotion. When Lily finished, the auditorium erupted into applause. She smiled brightly and searched the crowd until she found her father. Ethan stood first, clapping harder than anyone else. Lily beamed. Victoria found herself standing too, applauding with everyone else. As the audience settled back into their seats, she looked toward Ethan again. For months, she had admired his character. Tonight, she finally understood the source of it. His strength had never come from achievement. It came from love. And for the first time, Victoria Sterling felt her carefully guarded heart begin to change. Winter settled deeper over Denver during the weeks that followed. Christmas decorations appeared across storefronts. Neighborhood streets glowed with colored lights, and a quiet sense of anticipation filled the city. At Sterling Logistics, however, the mood was very different. A major infrastructure contract worth hundreds of millions of dollars was suddenly in jeopardy. Months of planning had unraveled after unexpected engineering complications surfaced during final review. Senior executives crowded conference rooms. Consultants flew in from around the country. Yet every proposed solution created new problems. Victoria found herself working longer hours than she had in years. One snowy evening, she remained alone in her office long after sunset. Reports covered her desk. Spreadsheets glowed across multiple monitors. The city lights outside blurred against the glass as exhaustion settled over her shoulders. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Richard Sterling stepped inside, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "You look tired," he said. Victoria accepted the cup with a faint smile. "We may lose the contract." Richard sat down across from her. And it matters, does it?" Victoria sighed. "Dad, this project affects thousands of jobs." Richard nodded. "Then solve it." "I have been trying for 3 weeks." Silence filled the office. Finally, Richard glanced toward one of the engineering reports. "Have you asked Ethan?" Victoria laughed. "Ethan is not even involved." "That was not my question." She shook her head. Yet later that night, after staring at the same problem for another hour, she found herself doing exactly that. The next afternoon, she drove to Ethan's workshop on the edge of town. Snow crunched beneath her boots as she entered the building. Ethan was helping several robotics students assemble a prototype machine. When the students left, Victoria explained the situation. Ethan listened carefully. He asked questions. Lots of questions. Not about profits. Not about investors. About logistics. Materials. Safety. Long-term reliability. Within 30 minutes, he walked to a whiteboard and began sketching an alternative approach. One solution led to another. One adjustment solved 3 separate complications. Victoria watched in disbelief as months of gridlock gradually unraveled beneath simple, practical reasoning. 2 hours later, she stared at the completed diagram. This could work. Ethan smiled. "I think so. Why did nobody else see this?" Ethan shrugged. "Sometimes people stand too close to a problem." Victoria laughed softly. "You make it sound easy. Most difficult things become easier when your ego leaves the room." The answer lingered with her. 3 weeks later, the revised proposal secured approval. The contract was saved. Executives celebrated throughout Sterling Logistics headquarters. Financial analysts praised Victoria's leadership. Industry publications applauded the company. Yet when reporters asked how the breakthrough happened, she found herself thinking about a small workshop filled with students and a man who never cared about recognition. That evening, Victoria visited her father. Richard listened quietly as she described everything Ethan had done. When she finished, he smiled. Now you understand. Understand what? Richard leaned back in his chair. For months you believed I wanted you to notice Ethan because he would make a good husband. Victoria frowned slightly. You did not. Richard shook his head. No, she looked surprised. Richard's voice softened. I wanted you to notice him because he is the kind of person success cannot improve and hardship cannot diminish. Victoria sat quietly. That is rare. Richard nodded. Very rare. Then he smiled. And I think you are finally beginning to see it. Christmas Eve arrived beneath a blanket of fresh snow. Denver glowed with thousands of lights strung across rooftops, storefronts, and city parks. The air carried the scent of pine, cinnamon, and wood smoke drifting from neighborhood chimneys. For the first time in years, Victoria found herself looking forward to something that could not be measured on a balance sheet. Earlier that week, she had received an invitation from Ethan. It was simple, a community holiday gathering at the recreation center where he volunteered. No executives, no donors, no publicity, just families. When Victoria arrived that evening, children were decorating cookies, volunteers served hot chocolate, and holiday music played softly through speakers mounted near the ceiling. The room felt warm despite the winter storm outside. She spotted Ethan helping a group of children assemble small wooden toy cars at a work table near the corner. Lily sat beside him, concentrating carefully as she painted one bright red. When Lily noticed Victoria entering, her face immediately brightened. You came. Victoria smiled. I said I would. Lily nodded as if that settled an important matter. Throughout the evening, Victoria found herself slipping naturally into conversations she would normally avoid. She helped distribute gifts. She listened to parents tell stories. She laughed with children who had no idea who she was. Nobody treated her like a chief executive. Nobody asked about company performance or market forecasts. For several hours, she was simply Victoria. Later, after most families had gone home, she stepped outside for fresh air. Snowflakes drifted beneath the glow of nearby streetlights. The parking lot stood quiet except for a handful of remaining vehicles. A moment later, Ethan joined her. Long night, he said. A good one. Victoria nodded. Silence settled comfortably between them. Not awkward. Not forced. The kind of silence that only exists when two people no longer feel pressure to impress each other. Finally, she spoke. Can I ask you something? Ethan smiled. You usually do. She looked down at the snow beneath her boots. Why have you never treated me differently? Ethan appeared genuinely confused. Differently than what? Than everyone else does. He considered the question. Because you are still a person. Victoria laughed softly. That sounds simpler than it should. Most truths are. The wind carried snow across the parking lot. Victoria stared into the distance for several seconds before speaking again. Do you know what I used to think my father wanted? What? I thought he wanted me to choose someone like you. Ethan raised an eyebrow. And now? Victoria smiled faintly. Now I think he wanted me to become someone more like you. Ethan looked away for a moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. Your father gives you less credit than you deserve. The words caught her off guard. Every compliment she had received throughout her life had been tied to achievement. Intelligence, leadership, success. This felt different. It felt personal, genuine. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. Snow continued falling around them, while warm lights spilled from the recreation center windows behind them. And for the first time since that night at the charity gala, Victoria realized she was no longer trying to understand Ethan Brooks. She was simply grateful that he had entered her life. 1 year later, the first snowfall of December drifted gently across Denver. The city looked softer somehow, wrapped in white and gold beneath holiday lights that stretched across streets and storefronts. Inside Ethan's home, the scent of cinnamon, pine, and freshly baked cookies filled the air. The house that had once felt quiet now carried a different kind of warmth. Laughter moved easily through the rooms. Music played softly in the background. Life had not become perfect. It had simply become shared. Lily sat beside the Christmas tree, carefully placing the final ornament on a lower branch. Her smile was brighter than it had been a year earlier. Confidence had slowly replaced uncertainty. Joy had begun replacing grief. Across the room, Ethan carried a box of decorations down from a closet shelf, while Victoria arranged wrapped gifts beneath the tree. Neither of them spoke much. They did not need to. The comfort between them had grown naturally through countless ordinary moments. School events, volunteer projects, family dinners, long conversations that stretched late into the evening. Small acts of kindness repeated so often they became a way of life. A gentle knock sounded at the door. Richard Sterling stepped inside carrying a pie and immediately shook snow from his coat. I was told there would be food. Lily laughed. Grandpa Richard, you already know there will be food. Richard smiled and handed her the pie. Smart girl. The evening passed quietly. They shared dinner, told stories, remembered old holidays. Outside, snow continued falling in slow, peaceful waves. Eventually, the gifts were exchanged. Wrapping paper covered the floor. Hot chocolate steamed from mugs resting on side tables. Then Victoria picked up a small box she had set aside earlier. She walked toward Lily and knelt beside her chair. The room gradually grew quiet. Ethan watched without saying a word. Lily looked curious. This one is for you, Victoria said softly. Lily accepted the package and carefully opened it. Inside was a silver charm bracelet. Hanging from it were tiny symbols collected over the past year. A violin, a snowflake, a book, a small heart. Each one represented a memory they had shared together. Lily stared at it for several seconds. Her eyes slowly filled with tears. Not sad tears. The kind that appear when someone realizes they are deeply loved. Victoria swallowed hard. I know I cannot replace anyone, she said quietly. And I never wanted to. But I hope you know how much you mean to me. The room fell completely silent. Snow tapped softly against the windows. Christmas lights reflected across the glass. Lily looked down at the bracelet. Then she looked toward Ethan. For a brief moment, father and daughter held each other's gaze. Ethan smiled and gave the smallest nod. It was all she needed. Lily turned back toward Victoria and wrapped her arms around her. Then she whispered a single word. Mom. No one spoke afterward. Richard lowered his eyes and smiled. Ethan stood perfectly still. Victoria closed her eyes as tears slipped down her cheeks. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of grace, full of healing, full of second chances. 1 year earlier, a wealthy CEO had believed a single father needed something missing from his life. Now everyone in that room understood the truth. The person who had needed a family most had been Victoria all along. And in the quiet dignity of ordinary love, she had finally found one.